Okay, so we're going to be talking about Ottoman population registers today. As David mentioned, my name is Jonathan McCollum. I'm a specialist in Ottoman history. I did my PhD in Middle Eastern history with special emphasis on the Ottoman Empire. I taught at Brigham Young University for a few years, and now I'm working for Family Search, and I head up content strategy for the Middle East, North Africa area for Family Search. And one thing that I've been doing a lot of work with are these population registers, what are called Nüfus registers. And they've been rather intriguing, and I've enjoyed the work with them. I think they have a lot of potential for genealogical research, as well as demographic and social history research. And really, the genealogical potential is evident from the Turkish state's use of these records in their e-Devlet system, in which they actually give the Republic of Turkey. If you are a citizen of Turkey, you can go on to their e-Devlet, their state website, put in your name, and they will generate a family tree. And in many cases, the family trees that they give you, that they give, right, a Turkish citizen, go back to the 18th century. And the Turkish state is relying upon these Ottoman population registers, the Nüfus registers, to be able to do that. Now, so today I'd just like to talk a little bit about them with you and tell you basically what information can be gleaned from them, what are some difficulties that you may have in approaching them, and where you can find them. The Ottoman Empire was an expansive empire that incorporated basically 26 modern states, right, from basically Algeria all the way to Qatar to Ukraine to Bosnia. So this is a very large empire. Now, the empire had begun to shrink due to competition and European encroachment on its territories. But still, at its very end, it encompassed quite a number of states within both Europe and Western Asia and the Middle East. Now, Ottoman population registration. Like most states and like any empire, the Ottoman Empire ran on paper, we say. It needed to be able to surveil its population because it needed to tax them, and it also needed to conscript them. And so for the purpose of taxation, we see that there is population registration. Well, not so much population registration, but something like census, the Tapu Tahrir Defterleri. These are Ottoman sources that date back into the 15th century, in which the Ottoman state would go out and actually collect names and figure out who would be paying all the taxes throughout their empire. So that system persisted for a few centuries. It wasn't very detailed or really that robust, but by basically the late 17th, early 18th century, the Ottoman state had basically decentralized and was no longer conducting those censuses. But with the advent of the 19th century, we see this growth of records and surveillance of the population. And this is an attempt by the state to basically catch up to the Europeans, to be able to field as many soldiers as the Europeans on the battlefield, and collect enough taxes to prevent European incursions into their territory. So really, by about 1830, we get an effort to register the population, and you get the first Nüfus registers. Nüfus is just the Ottoman word for population. Now, this system became highly centralized and highly accurate by the late 19th century, to the extent that all citizens were issued one of these, which is what Ottomans in that day referred to as the Nüfus tezkerisi. It says the Devlete Aliye Osmaniye tezkerisi. This is an ID that was issued, a state ID, to everyone within the Ottoman Empire. So we see that Ahmed here, who was born in 1273 of the Rumi calendar, which we'll speak about today, and he was a Muslim, right? Was issued this Nüfus tezkerisi, this state ID, and this was part of this population registration scheme. Now, today I'll talk to you a little bit about examples that I've extracted from Nablus in Palestine. So Nablus is sort of in the center of the West Bank today, and so sort of the heart of old Palestine. And over the past year or so, I've been working with Brigham Young University students. I've trained them to be able to basically, read a bit of these Nüfus registers and index them. These were BYU students that had a high level of Arabic, so I targeted Arabic majors that were just about completing their major, and we've been working, and at this point I think we have about 25,000 names indexed from the records just from this Nablus area. And so the records that you'll see are taken from this indexing enterprise. So we have multiple different record types in this Nüfus register system. The first one that we see evident that the Ottoman Empire was utilizing in the area of Palestine and basically throughout the empire was the Defteri Nüfus. We see in Palestine that this is in use by about the late 1870s. This record pictured here did not have extensive content. What you can find on this record are all the male members of the household, their military status, their birth date and age, their connection to other family members. So you'd have a patriarch, and then you would have all younger males, and you'd understand their connection to them through this record. This does not include their birth location or their location of residence, but we can surmise their residence based on where the register is located. So the register in this case says it's from Nablus. So we imagine that somewhere within the district of Nablus, it might be within the city itself or in the surrounding outlying area. The people that are mentioned here were resident, at least at the time of taking the recorder taking down these details of the individual. Now, what we see is a further development of these records. And as we're going through the Nablus records, we see that by 1895, this record, the Sigili Nüfus Defteri, becomes more prominent. What we see on this record is the names of the individual, including their sort of surname or the name that they were known by. We get a description of how the person looked. We get their date of birth. We get their location of residence. We get sort of their military rank if they have one, or their capability to be conscripted within the army. And so this is a further development of this record keeping system, and it provides a more robust understanding of the individual. Now, what we see by the early 20th century is further development of these records. For Nablus, we're seeing these in 1905, but I believe they started throughout the empire over a decade earlier, and they're referred to as the Musvede Defteri. We get a whole lot of information about a family from these records. So not only, and I can go through this with you, not only do you get the name of the individual, you get their occupation, you also learn whether or not the person's parents are alive, are living at the time of recording. So you get the individual's father and the individual's mother. So for instance, we have, this is continuing from a previous record, but we have the wife of the previous individual on the earlier page, whose name is Amina. And we get to know that her father was Saad bin Muhammad Aude. And we get to know that his mother was Hakka. And we also learn that this family is Muslim. Islam is mentioned here. We also learn the date of birth of the individual. Now, this is something that's important to note, is that these records are kept with the Rumi calendar. Now, the Rumi calendar was a calendar developed within the Ottoman Empire and utilized by the Ottoman state. Its starting date is the Hijri, is the Hijra. So similar to the Hijri calendar, the Islamic calendar. So it begins in 622 with Muhammad's flight to Mecca. But unlike the Islamic calendar, this is not a lunar calendar, but a solar calendar. And the calendar, the year begins in the month of, basically our month of March. And so you basically need to use a calculation system to be able to take the person's birth date and calculate that within our sort of Gregorian calendar, in our Christian calendar. So right here we see that this person was born in 1290, and this is a site that I sometimes use to do just precisely this calculation. Let's see if it opens up here for us. There we go. So I can select Rumi, and then it was 1290, and that's year, right? This is month and this is day, and I've selected the Rumi calendar takvim, and I can calculate that for our Christian calendar, our Gregorian calendar. So the birth calendar, 1874, 1875 was the birth date of this individual. So we learn when the person was born. We learn where the person was born. We also, if it's filled out properly, which this isn't, we also learn what they looked like, their hair color, everything like that. We also learn whether or not the person had multiple wives, if it's a male. So we get a fuller understanding of the individual and the connections within the family. So this is all sort of one family here. And we learned, right, that this is a wife, this is a sister, right, this is another sister. These are basically all females we see listed here. Okay, now moving along. Now there's one more record type that we have encountered. That's the Esas Defteri. This is yet another Nüfus defteri, right? Another Nüfus register. It's basically similar in precision to the Musvede defteri. It has all the same information on it. And the dates that we're seeing for Nablus are between 1912 and 1917 right now. So this is a pretty potent selection of records that can allow people that have ancestors from Palestine to locate their families. And I've talked to actually people that have gone through the effort of looking through these records one by one to find their ancestors. So these are very useful. And what we're trying to do at Family Search is create an index for them, and hopefully for the entire area of Palestine. Certainly Palestine is a rather represents a country that is of importance for family history research, just because it's a very diasporic population. There are Palestinians sort of spread all throughout the world, and they can then utilize this to sort of locate their ancestors, because these records are positioned in time at a precise moment in which people can the people contained in these records that are recorded in these records, they're no longer in living memory, and so people can find their ancestors through them. Now, finally, what I just like to say is that these records are not just, they didn't just exist within Palestine. They were utilized throughout the empire at that point. So basically, most of what in the Arab world we refer to as the Mashriq, so sort of this the eastern portion of it, everything east of basically Egypt up to the border with Iran was represented in these records. So these records were kept in Baghdad, they were kept in Lebanon, they were kept throughout Anatolia, and in the Balkan countries as well that remained in the empire at this time period. And that's basically all I have for my presentation at this moment. And so I'd like to open up for any questions that you may have.
Well, there were some questions that came in. This is from Danny. He says, curious what cadence these registers had over time.
Okay. Well, over time, there was a system in place by the late 19th century in which everyone was being recorded in these registers, and these registers were being kept. And and from historical research from various parts of the empire, what we're seeing is about 95 to 98% of the population in most cases were captured within these records. Now, prior to 1870, the early 1870s, when there is this push, more concerted push to centralize record keeping, what we see is more sporadic record keeping. So we see a push in the early 1830s to 1840s when we get the first true sort of Ottoman census at that point. And then we also see some regional developments. Midhat Pasha, a sort of very important governor who governed both sort of Rumeli, sort of Bulgaria, and also what is now basically Iraq. He instituted a system of population registration, and his experiences were utilized in this later push and drive to surveil the entire population and record them within these records. So basically what we're seeing is by the late 19th century, there is consistent record keeping and so you're going to find it. You're going to find individuals. If you're looking for someone within a space of, say, just a few years, they will emerge on these records. Even births are mentioned in these records so many times, right? Even children that do not reach a very old age before they unfortunately pass away. Many times they are captured in these records. Okay, what else do we have here? I think there's
Danny followed up with how much of this would have been retained, purposefully destroyed during the conflicts with Armenia.
So none of it would have been destroyed purposefully. But the issue is, can we have access to it? So right now, you can go into the Ottoman archives in Istanbul and look at the census records from basically the early 19th century to about the 1860s. But these records that I'm showing you for the territory of Turkey, they are kept within what is called the Nüfus ve Vatandaşlık İşleri Genel Müdürlüğü. It's like the Department of Citizenship and Population Affairs. And I'm setting up a trip to go to Turkey to hopefully gain access to this archive this year. We'll see if it works out. But they have these records and they utilize them. The Armenians will also be in these records. Now, there will be, during the time of the genocide and the adoption of Armenians, I don't think these records will be. So during the genocide, during these horrific massacres, many times women and children would be adopted into Muslim families, Kurdish, Turkish, Arab families in the Ottoman Empire. I don't know if these records would be able to be granular enough to indicate, right, who these people were. That's a question I'd like to look into. Of course, these are extremely sensitive questions. The Turkish state is not all that happy with anyone that goes around trying to sort of look for things Armenian. I'm hoping that that things are moving in a positive direction on that front, but it seems to be more of the same over time. But yeah, I would be curious. That's a question that I would like to answer.
Here's Darlene. She says, were these records kept in Hungary?
So what you'll find in Hungary is the Tapu Tahrir Defterleri. And you only have about a century or so of Ottoman rule within the territory that's now Hungary. So those records, you could find individuals there. You might also be able to find jizye records. These are records where in which Zimi, so non-Muslims, were recorded for tax purposes, because then the reaya, the non-Muslims of the empire, had to pay a special poll tax. And so you might be able to find individuals from that time period of the 16th century. That's a possibility for Hungary.
Okay. And then Mary asks, I am interested in the Turkish population of Cyprus. Would there be registers for Cyprus? Where would they be kept?
There would be registers for Cyprus, sort of earlier registers, and then what happens is you get British occupation, and so some of these registers that I'm showing you would not have continued into the British occupation of the island. And so the ones that you would probably want to look for would be the earlier ones, and those would be in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. But British record keeping practices were pretty significant, and so it might be interesting to look at the National Archives in London just to see what they have on Cyprus.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name right. Aram, Aram. He says, my Armenian ancestors were either killed or escaped in the early 1900s. Will I be able to get any help from these records? Most of my ancestors were in Anatolia or western parts of Turkey.
Yes.
Anatolia.
Okay, great, Autumn. And this is the big question that we are trying to answer is we want to gain access to these records for Anatolia. We've found them in, say, Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Bulgaria, but the territory of Anatolia is kept within the archives of that, right, of the Nüfus Genel, and that's the real question is, can we gain access to those archives? And so part of my efforts this year are to really see if we can gain access. And if we can, then yes, you would be able to find your ancestors, even those that were victims of the genocide. So certainly if you know their names, they are in those records. And again, that's something that we want to be able to pursue and find these individuals. Okay. Who do we have next?
Wendy, I'll let you kind of read through that question
Okay.
and kind of answer it as best you can. It's probably the fourth question from the bottom. So
Okay. Do we, Wendy, can you tell us what time period we're looking at here for your ancestors for Kirkor and Toros?
let's see, I'm watching comments.
Late
Sorry,
18.
yes, 1800s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Ottoman Bank is interesting. If you go to SALT, SALT, that archive within Istanbul, they have a lot of bank records there, where you might be able to see some of this money that is sent. You'd have to do the investigation in person, on location, but that's an interesting approach that you may have there. You can also utilize Armenian church records, at least for things like, birth, baptism, death, and many of those are available for the territory of Anatolia and Istanbul on Family Search's website. So I'd recommend that approach as well, for anything Armenian. In terms of Ottoman records, these individuals would be counted in multiple population registers. But Istanbul, the record keeping was relatively granular and robust, even from the sort of early 19th century. And so that is an approach. When we get to that later point after the 1870s, we can no longer use the Istanbul Ottoman archives, which are open to the public. We have to again go to that Nüfus Vatandaşlık Genel Müdürlüğü. So we're sort of stuck there. But yeah, I'd be interested to investigate SALT, that archive that has a lot of the Ottoman bank records, just to see what we can find there. So that could be an interesting approach.
Well, I'm sure that will be very helpful. So Mary says Peninsula Arab records.
Okay, so Peninsula Arab records. I would love to go to Saudi Arabia. I've been trying to get there. Family Search doesn't want to send me there. So, um, but they have some of these records. It depends on where you're talking about on in the Arabian Peninsula. Um, if we're talking about the areas in which there was strong Ottoman influence, or right actual sort of the Ottoman system was in place, so like the Hijaz or Jeddah, you're the these records were kept in those locations as well, and so you would be able to utilize this record set to find individuals. The question is, who's keeping these records, and have some of them made their way to this entity, right? The population department in Ankara in Turkey, or do they still reside in Saudi Arabia? I From what I've seen, it looks like that these registers, some of them were sent back to the capital in Istanbul, probably copies of them, but copies were maintained locally. And with the rapid deterioration of the Ottoman positions in 1917, a lot of these records were remained on site, and so we could probably consider that the records in parts of Saudi Arabia remain in Saudi Arabia. And then the question is, has the Saudi state found them and archived them? I know they have Ottoman holdings. I just want to know sort of to what extent they've collected them from their country and centralized them. So that's a sort of endeavor that I'd have to do in Riyadh. Now, in terms of other records that you may have in the Arabian Peninsula, very limited records. If they're not Ottoman records, you have maybe tribal lineages. There's a lot of published tribal lineages. If you are concerned from a very sort of Western perspective of proving out lineage, tribal lineages are not the best path to take. However, if you're sort of more locally adept and you're happy to just accept tribal lineages, many of them which are sort of manufactured for many political and social reasons, you can find a lot of published works from on tribal lineages from the Arabian Peninsula.
Oh, okay. Danny's got a follow-up question. Is there any evidence or implication in the records of an Armeno-Turkish language mashup in documents?
In these documents, no. So in the documents I was showing you, no, everything is in Ottoman Turkish. However, right, there was certainly there was Armeno-Turkish, right? It was a so basically Turkish written with Armenian characters. Whole books were published in Armeno-Turkish. In fact, I think the first book published in Turkish on a press was published in Armeno-Turkish, so in this Turkish with Armenian characters. And so there were many Armenians that were there, that their first language was Turkish, and they utilized it. However, in terms of these official Ottoman records, everything was kept with the sort of the Arabic alphabet, so the Ottoman Arabic alphabet. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Stephen asks, will you please include the question on Albania, 1430 through 1800? Anything that might exist there?
Okay, so to my knowledge, there should be Tapu Tahrir Defterleri from Albania, from the region of Albania. So from the late 15th century, I believe. And then you would have also these records, and I'd have to sort of search out and figure out where these records are, but they were certainly being collected and registered within Albania in the 19th century. In the 17th century, you may have some records, but it begins to peter out when you get sort of more local rule. So 17th, 18th century. But when you get the centralization of the Ottoman state in the 19th century, you get a lot more records on Albania, especially in terms of surveillance of the population and sort of recording of actual individuals rather than just the eminent individuals that would show up at any period. When you go to the Ottoman archives in Turkey, you can find, right, thousands and upon thousands of records from Albania, but these are generally political in nature and aren't entirely helpful for, say, family historical research.
Okay. Candace says, thank you, Jonathan. This session has been extremely helpful. My question is, would the records for Lebanon be available digitally on Family Search?
Right now, the records are only available from Palestine. So just from Palestine, the records are only available at family history centers. They are available online, but you have to be in a family history center. In terms of Lebanon, that's a big question mark for me that I have to pursue. I know I've seen some of these records, and I know that the Lebanese state, even after independence, persisted in recreating these records. They're almost identical, except now they're written in Arabic rather than Ottoman Turkish. So I believe that many of these records remain in Lebanon. The problem is, after so many wars, it's hard to gain access to any archives in Lebanon, and much of what they had has been destroyed, unfortunately. But that's something that I would like to pursue, and if I can, I'd like to spend some time in Lebanon, precisely for that reason, to see if we can locate them. I believe probably that there's a good degree of records still in Turkey pertaining to Lebanon, and so we'd have to take a look at that when I go to Ankara as well. So I'll try to keep you up to date on that, Candace. If you want to, if anybody wants to, they can always send me an email. I try to get back to everyone. I'm putting my email in the chat here. Don't share it with all of your friends because I get overloaded with emails. But I do want to sincerely help you in whatever way I can. I'm hoping that we will gain access to more records from Lebanon and make them available digitally. I think it's an imperative, just because you have this massive Lebanese diaspora, as I imagine you're sort of part of that, and that's what makes you ask that question.
Well, the depth of your knowledge is impressive. I hope everyone knows how lucky they are to be able to pick your brain here for a while. So Aram's got a follow-up question. I missed where you said the Armenian records are in Family Search.
Yes. So Autumn, if you look up there is an arrangement with the Armenian state between their archives and Family Search. And if you look up the records for Armenia, you'll get many collections for Anatolia. And these date back to the 19th century. So they are accessible online. And if you unfortunately, Family Search, sometimes it's difficult to find precisely what you're looking for. But I think even if you look up Turkey, do a search for Turkey and records, you do a record search for Turkey, you'll probably get those Armenian records in that search as well.
Oh, perfect. Mary makes a statement, but I'm going to anticipate what her question is, or a question related to this. My curiosity, she says, comes from a 23andMe results surprise. Thank you for your endeavor. Safe travels. So, what if somebody does get a surprise in their DNA, the Middle East?
From the Middle East, well, there is a lot of movement between the Middle East and Europe. So if you're someone that is European, of European ancestry, and Middle Eastern ancestry comes up in your DNA report, it probably means that somewhere down the line, right, someone from the Middle East is your ancestor, and you just have to remember that it wasn't like there was an iron curtain between the Middle East and Europe. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was a European empire, and in fact, at many points in the Ottoman Empire, the population was greater in Europe in the empire than it was within the Middle East, and there was a lot of movement of people between those areas. And so, yeah, considerable there's a considerable amount of influence from the Middle East on Europe, and certainly that carries through with people moving into Europe. And then there's just the various sort of diasporas from the Middle East. What we've seen since the late 19th century on, there's been a massive amount of Middle Eastern movement to Western Europe and the Americas. So there's many ways in which you can you can have a Middle Eastern ancestor.
Fascinating. Danny has a follow-up question. He has a 200-page Armeno-Turkish journal from my great-grandfather during the genocide, and have struggled with the lead to get it translated. Any ideas?
I can read it. I don't know if I have time to translate it. Armeno-Turkish is very easy to read. If you know Ottoman Turkish and you know the Armenian alphabet. There's unfortunately not that many people that can read it that aren't specialists. So there's just a handful of people that can read them. I wonder if I could find a student that would want to do that for a price. I mean, I'd love to help out people, but I don't have the bandwidth to translate 200 pages. I'd be happy to look at a few pages for you and tell you what it says. But yeah, reach out to me, send me an email. I'll see, because I've taught at Brigham Young University for quite a few years, and I've been teaching Turkish to people that know Armenian, so I might be able to find someone that I could at least instruct, and then they could run with it. But yeah, I have in the past done some Armeno-Turkish translation.
Oh, that's sounds like a solution for you, Danny. So thank you for that offer. Just kind of scanning through, it says, would there be the same info for the Pontus region of Turkey, re Greeks?
Yes. Well, yeah, be careful, because sometimes, right, there's Turks that are very, very consider themselves very, very Turkish, and they don't realize how Greek they really are. They will, yeah, it's a strange anomaly in which, right, you get such hyper nationalism in a place where, right, there was such diversity as the Pontus region. So yes, there would be the same information for the Pontus region. Again, you can find earlier records, population registration records and census records up until about the 1860s at the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. Thereafter, right, we have to gain access to that Nüfus Müdürlüğü, right, that population department in Turkey to get those records. But yes, they certainly did exist, and the people there were recorded in these same records.
Okay. Well, that looks like it kind of winds down our questions. Any kind of concluding statements, things that kind of came to mind that you may have passed over that you want to summarize with? Or
yeah, so I just want to express my thanks for all of your participation. Excellent questions. What I would like to stress is there are options for family history research in the Middle East. Your ancestors were recorded in records, and we as historians, as family historians, as genealogists, as investigators, we need to seek out and be creative and find ways where we can gain access to some of these records in which we don't have access to at this moment, and we also need to sort of build a larger community in which we can collaborate. So I hope that you've learned a bit from this, and this sort of whets your appetite for the possibilities. I'd also say, if you do have ancestry from the Middle East and you are aching for a way to connect with them, I'd say start with language. It's important to learn the Arabic alphabet. It's important to consider what languages will be most helpful. It might be, if you are from Armenian ancestry, it might be learning Armenian. But right, the combination of Turkish and Armenian is very important. So look into ways in which you can develop your language abilities, because that's one thing that I think we're really missing within this community of people that are interested in their ancestors, are people that can do exactly what Autumn was requesting. And finally, I just like to say, hey, good night, and thanks for staying up with me. Okay, and it's a great pleasure to interact with you.